There are things you can't say in English. There, things are based on a dualism, a mind, spirit, mind, body dualism. And that's not what's going on in Yoruba.
Welcome to Selfhood, a podcast that asks the question, who am I? We believe the quest of all quests is the quest to find oneself and engage scholars and experts in various fields to build a rich, layered picture of this journey. I'm Pooja,
And I'm Jose.
and we're your co-hosts.
And today it's been a long time coming, but our guest today is Dr. Mei Mei Sanford, an associate teaching professor of Africana Studies at the College of William and Mary. Dr. Sanford's research focuses on African and African-diasporic religions, particularly Yoruba traditions, and their relation to gender, art, and ways of knowing. She was a former Fulbright and Ford Fellow in Nigeria, where she researched the concept of embodiment in Yoruba religion. Dr. Sanford, thank you for joining us. We're really excited to have you on the podcast today. I know it's been a long time coming, like I said earlier, but we're truly excited to have you and to hear more from you.
Thank you. Pleasure.
Now, before we get into our some of our other questions, would you like to go into talking about your research and your background maybe and how it all can relate to this question of selfhood? Um, if you don't mind.
Okay. Um, how did I begin with this research? Joshua, as you know, there are many answers to that, long and short. Um, but I think one of them that's relevant here is, I mean, sometimes when I need the elevator speech answer, it's that I was living in New York, and Robert Farris Thompson said New York is a secret African city, and really not so secret. Uh, a slightly longer answer is that I was very interested in what it was like to live with deities. And I had been very much aware of traditions that feminists working on traditions, kind of reconstructing and reimagining. But I thought, I want to go somewhere where this is how people live. This is now. This is unbroken. This is ordinary. So that was, um, so that's one answer that I think is important here. I I wondered at first when you um, both of you centered the idea of personhood, but I've been thinking about it and leaning into it. And one of the things that occurs to me is that I make a point of saying at the beginning of my classes is that what is a person? What is an adult? What is a marriage? Um, what is a family? These are not universals, and I think that's one of the most important things about um, teaching in Africana studies is to help students begin to look for that and understand that. And I remember being struck some time ago. I was uh, on a bus going to a demo from William and Mary and talking with a um, North African student who was a senior in psychology and sociology. But one of the things that she said was that she was um, even though you would think issues of what is a person would be central, that often she found that those were not critically engaged in those two departments, that there were assumptions that this is that contemporary US or recent 250, 350 US that's it, and that the dominant narratives are it. So the more I thought about it, the more I thought about, yeah, let's talk about personhood.
Thank you for sharing that overview, and that's really interesting that, that's sort of what you begin your courses with. Um, yeah, no, we definitely share that, it's a question that should be asked more and centered more in the way that we, talk about different disciplines. I am curious, kind of building off of what you had just mentioned, how that, issue of what is the self, what is the family, what is marriage, differs from sort of, at least in your experience with students, like their conceptions walking into the class versus, how they might walk out after having studied these traditions.
Well, I don't want to go on too long about this because I know I could, but just ideas about, for example, ideas about um, family in Ghana, where it's matrilineal and matrilocal, and also it's dual sex leadership at every level, and family lineage, town, and then finally the Ashanti nation. And um, and the core and people live in their mother's house, and couples do not live together. I mean, it's all of this is changing with globalization and colonialism, but people live in their mother's house, and what is essential is that matrilineal mothers, siblings, uncles, children. Um, so there's that, and also in that world, um, an adult is adults. The idea of who is an adult, it doesn't differ between men and women. And everybody is expected to be financially someone who is productive, and and then again also supported by their matrilineage, but it doesn't differ male to female. And then there's Dahomey, where marriage, the whole society was constructed uh, on the paradigm of marriage. And so women married the sovereign, and and this immense cosmopolitan world was the palace that was populated mostly by women, either who were relatives, blood relatives, or who had married in. And these women who had married in were warriors and uh, dignitaries and emissaries, and again had their own money. This all through West Africa. Women, it's their own stuff. So this and this idea of marrying and this cosmopolitan world. So you give up certain things, but then you find ways to become you don't your family has no bearing. You can't call up, get in touch with your family and say, bring me home. I don't like this here. But what you can do is you can move through this um, cosmopolitan world and become rich and influential and help out your blood family. And uh, I can see the trade-off.
Yeah, and I think one of the striking things I learned from your course was, or at least I learned to sort of like rethink how I think about learning about different cultures. I guess to look at things from a less ethnocentric way, because I sort of come in with the idea of like of the Western sort of ideas of being or meaning, and it's important to put sort of like cast those aside in a way. And one of the most important ones was this idea of lineal sort of like loyalty, right, in religion, as if like one family sort of is attached, for the lack of a better term, to this one Orisha, where the family line is sort of like connected to this Orisha. And so as we sort of like talk about that, I want to get a little bit more as like background about the Yoruba tradition, and how is it for someone who has never sort of like really heard about the religion, like what would you like what would you share about it, and what is like you know the background, the origins, or as you understand it, and yeah, can you speak to that a little bit?
Did you say origins? I can't speak to that.
That's right.
Uh, I think as a way of sort of so laying down a few ideas here. This is a profoundly multiple poly world. Th There are many Orisha, they come into being. Um, there is a concept of of an all in all of a, but day to day, it's who is your Orisha? And one thing that interests and intrigues me is is that um, in the praise poems for Orisha, that phrase that becomes in the 19th and 20th century a Christian uh, Olodumare, the loosely translated as my all in all, the one. People are using it for their own Orisha.
Mm,
So it's and what you hear here is this is relationship. This is it's loyalty, but it's loyalty both ways, and it's dynamic. And um, Karen Barber writes about this and says it mirrors the dynamism in social structure, and that is that people become big men, big women, because they have people.
mm,
And but if they don't provide for those people, people go away. And that so people are, it's dynamic, it's intimate. And I mean, there are strains in Catholicism that are like this too, like Saint Anthony, help me, or I'm going to take your image and bury it headfirst in the garden. Um, and in Yoruba religion, people are saying, help me now, or else, I could go and, you know, cozy up to someone else, I could go I could go and become a Christian. I could go and become a Muslim, come on. But it's, but I think she overestimates that people don't leave that much. And people can always be adding, but it's a lot of work to take on another marriage, you know? Yeah, do it if you've got the energy. If you got a couple of extra days a week, yeah, go ahead, do it. Uh, so that this and so this poly nature, but it's a poly nature of the world, and that is that people have a relationship. So in a family, they're different. People get called by different Orisha, or they can approach an Orisha and say, "Please help me, please help me." And if you do, I will. Uh, but these are intimate things. These are events in the world in relation or to the sacred. And so people are not, it's not a proselytizing world. It's it, I oversay this, but I enjoy it. And that is that, people don't say, your deity is Oshun. Yeah, that's cute. But where it's really happening is Shango. That's like saying, like a dog saying to a cat, cats are so where it really is at is dogs. I mean, it doesn't compute in the mind. Uh, and it's also not. You've Joshua, you've heard me say in class that we're not talking belief primarily. Belief is a very Protestant idea. It's not even a Catholic idea. Uh, my dissertation director, Karen McCarthy Brown, said, who was a white Texan who was initiated in voodoo, and this was her life. Um, and you've read some of her work. And she said, white people sometimes ask me after I've spoken, because she was very much a public intellectual, well, but do you believe in voodoo? And she said, that's a question that no Haitian has ever asked me. No voodooisant has ever asked me. What do they ask me? They ask me, do you serve the spirits? It's action. It's not that's the center.
That's interesting. And before I get too far gone down the line here, but this concept of the Orisha, right? Like can you describe like the concept a little more? I know we're sort of like making the connection between the individual or families and the
Okay.
Orishas, but the Orishas themselves, like
It's so well, deeply, it's a mystery. It's an experience. Um, some of the Orisha are particularly connected to water or to iron or to technology or but also some to ideas, to values like justice, like like um, opening the way, like illness and healing, always in the same deity. That these are not separate; these are not polar. Um, at a certain point, um, some Yoruba scholars were saying they were once human beings on Earth, but and some Yoruba scholars, Nigerian Yoruba scholars who are immensely important. I think, though, that I mean we know that that Christian missionaries were faced with when they when they initially proselytized, people said, okay, let's add that. Come on. And then people were amazed when the missionary said, okay, but now you can't have any of that these Orisha, because these Orisha, as you said early on, are you can't separate them from the history of the family. So I think it was a missionary, there was a missionary strategy that said, okay, the Orisha are exemplary human beings, or larger than life human beings, who then became deified. But I think that was a missionary strategy because people were not letting go. And to this day, and after in the 90s, a student Pentecostal movement that really tried to that 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 came into being along with an economic very difficult period, um, attempted to um, push traditional religion out of the picture.
Yeah.
But even with that, and with people's um, new religious commitments, the names stay the same. And the names are, many of them are Orisha names. And so there it is. And one thing I had to give up early on was that I had to listen to the whole story and not simply. Uh, I write in an essay that I first wanted to listen only to Orisha stories, and when people started to talk to me about Christianity or Islam, I um, I I stopped listening. And then I began to realize that it would, and then I began to listen through those Christian and Muslim parts to the Orisha part. And then I realized that that was both impertinent and forced,
Mm.
and that what was important was this weaving and this entire reality and how people work with all of this. And yes, I think you're making me, you're giving me another lens here, because part of that is thinking about how, okay, I'm a Christian, and my parents were new Christians, and my grandmother was a traditionalist, and here I am. And in addition to being in a world that is this poly by nature, so it's not in nature, so it's not doesn't go very deep, this idea of telling people, well, your experience is not real.
Yeah, I think that's a really important perspective to have. Um, I don't know, I think I've seen a lot of, at least sort of in the environment that I've grown up, this sort of like, you have your perspective, um, and, negating others in order to have that. But I think that perspective that this tradition brings of like, being able to weave and not necessarily differentiate, is really important. I I want to come back to this idea of like how the tradition has held onto itself through sort of, the imposition of other traditions. But I wanted to, before that, go back to something you'd mentioned earlier about the tradition not being so grounded in belief, but in action, um, and in sort of being and actualizing this connection, Um, what does that look like in a person, in a community, to
Mm,
act in accordance with this tradition?
mm. And again, I'm hearing all this through this personhood lens that that you two have presented. But I think part of it is you don't do it by yourself. Um, and that relationship with an Orisha is interpersonal. Um, I went through an initiation in Nigeria, and when when my ritual mother asked me, she offered to initiate me, and when she and then and I asked her what that meant, what that would need have to be, and she said, keep a shrine and attend it every day. Um, make a feast in Nigeria every year that everybody can come to. And if somebody asks you to pray for them, do it. And that was it. And what I added on to it was, and look out for the people who have helped you and taught you. But that was it. It wasn't any, and I mean, they're food things like are divine for you and don't eat that. It'll mess you up. Um, which is different from the what belongs to what is true of your brother or your sister or your it's individual. But it was there was no and don't relate to this other religion or stop doing none of that, nothing. And it was also very, I mean, think about how human that was, how social that those were. Have a shrine, have a feast, help pray for people.
Yeah, yeah. No, it's beautiful that there's those sort of like there's the like personal relationship with the Orisha of like keeping a shrine, and then the sort of community element of like the feast, and then the third one sort of merges the two of you have your, practice of prayer, and you're also bringing the community into that. Um, yeah, that's a really interesting observation that it is, that community and that interpersonal aspect is such a core element of the practice, and it's not so self-centered and even ritual practice. Um, yeah, besides that, um, I'm trying to think of where the conversation could go. Um,
Well, I wonder, I'm kind of chomping at the bit to think about what a person is in this world. So could I riff on that?
yes, please.
Uh, so I have an uh, a family adopted me in Nigeria, and so my adopting brother, and his parents were alive, and so they became my adopting parents. Um, and one day I was learning about rituals of woodcarvers and and herbal preparations. And one day he Shango said to me, we were talking about something, and he said, This thing, the point was that when he said something my father taught you, and I said, well, you taught me, and he said, well, my father taught me, and I taught you. I think about this idea that this world, there is another world, Orum, which gets translated as heaven, but there's a cyclical sense to it. It's not a progress model. And people go and come from the other world. And Yoruba people, it's said, have the highest incidence of twins in the world. And some Yoruba botanists have studied this and said that plant estrogens in those big Ishu hairy yams make this happen. But anyway, this question of twins, what are they? Is this something that some tension about, is this something that animals do and not people? What's going on here? And we can see in Yoruba religion how this changes from this, oh no, bad thing to, oh no, this is ritually important. And and one of the explanations that comes through that develops is we all have a twin in the other world, and sometimes something weird happens and the twin comes through at the same time. So one of them is a being from used to being in this world where the Orisha live and grow and take their being, but somehow arrived here. Okay, so we have these two babies, and one of them is, like us, and one of them is pretty powerful. So we're going to treat them both really, really nicely. So, but another part of this is that they say that we all have Egbe societies, groups that we're connected to in the other world. And when we leave that world, we leave profoundly social again. When we're born, we leave that world. And sometimes an explanation for why there are repeated child deaths is that they're being called back. They're being called home. Their Egbe is wanting them. And 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 somebody will if a baby is cooing and there's nobody in the room, well, maybe it's their Egbe from the other world. Or if somebody there's some stuckness, sometimes it gets diagnosed in adults that you had a spouse in the other world and you have to ritually have a divorce so that you can move on in this world. So this idea that the other world is sort of like this and we go and come from it. And then there's this idea that parts of the soul are transmitted through the generations, but not on a one-to-one basis exactly. So people look at a child born and say, oh, look at that. That's just like what great aunt so-and-so, used to look at the world that way. That's her laugh, or you know, there she's taken it all in. So, but that doesn't mean so the child gets a name that like that means Iatunde, mother comes back, mother returns, or father returns. But it's not a one-to-one thing. There could be several people in a generation that had part of that soul. And again, it just goes like that. Uh, so so this so this idea of the self is not a hard shell on it.
Now, I think that's really interesting in trying to like go back to something you said earlier and trying to connect this point you just made about the self not being a shell. When we think about like you know as again as we mentioned earlier about like the how we conceptualize self in the West or in Western tradition versus like how like Yoruba tradition is much more like communal or like family based, right? In at least approaching the world. Um, I know we touched up on that a little bit in class when we looked at African derived religions in the US and then in the Caribbean. Uh, but as selfhood is concerned, right? Especially with those who are so even coming from the from the African diaspora, but this idea of the self, right? When which just I mean I use the US as an example because we're this is somewhere we all live, but like the idea of the self where like it seems a bit where like we're all very self we're focused on the self, we're focused on the individual. um, those who come here and who is used to this idea of the communal self, have you seen through your research, your experience, or otherwise, have you seen like any challenges or sort of like what has that been like trying to connect these two sort of like at least to me, it seemed like contradicting or opposing sort of ideas, and so yeah, how do they deal with that? And I think we touched on a little bit on that when we looked at the voodoo practices and then New York practitioners in New York, but like in a broader, much broader scope, like what have you seen to your I guess experience?
Would you answer that question yourself for the moment?
Um, I think I don't know.
And it can be about what you think was trying to communicate, or however you want to do it. But I just,
Well, my immediate sort of like reaction to at least what the ideas in New York and Miami as well, based on my last paper, was that they the African derived religions and the practitioners and they hold to this community, although it changes in different ways, right? It changes in ways that is, very unique to each sort of like social or I guess you could say political as well, sort of challenges they face. And so the Orishas and something beautiful you told me, and it which again changed my mind when after taking your class was this idea of religion not being static. So I never really thought about religion that way. And so like when you talk about like the Orishas and their origins and sort of like the idea of conceptualizing them was sort of like they're this one thing or this one person or this one being, and that's it. But like as we come to sort of like learn about the challenges, social, economic, whatever, they are you know, people who come here who have to adjust to Western ideas of self, um, they sort of change with or their religions or their view of not the religion per se, but like the view of how the Orisha is conceptualized or it sort of changes with them. I know, and I think that's been pretty much the biggest takeaway for me is how they adapt. It's like very, it's like an adaptive sort of, I don't know if strategy is the right word, but that for the lack of a
Mhm,
better one,
mhm.
that's the one I'm gonna use. But yeah, I think I think that pretty much uh at least from my like sort of small amount of information I've sort of gathered from our time together, but I'd love to hear your thoughts more
Okay.
on the
I
subject.
thank you. I I think I want to step away a little bit and talk about maybe now, and this may, I mean, I feel that you've asked such a big question. And, and I think the United States for everybody has changed in the last 100 years tremendously. And certainly into ideas of community and and individuals. I mean, Barbara Ehrenreich wrote something like this, that in 1900, 93% of Americans lived on farms, and in 2000, 7% of Americans lived on farms. And so most people, including Anglo-Americans, were living and growing up in a place where their generations of their family were and didn't. And now it's expected. What? Who cares? Uh, uh, you commit to a job, it can take you anywhere. But that's new. And I think it's new for everybody. And yes, there are oppressive legal systems and carceral systems and educational systems and all of these that that are militate against folks' ideas of community and sustenance. Yes, but I just mean, I see it everywhere, and I have a hard time um, answering the question. Um, I think another place that it feels like it's important to slot in right now is what Pooja gently returned me to, with that the first requirement was the shrine. So that is the relationship of the individual and the Orisha, and which is intimate. It's being called. It's, if not without ceremony, with endlessly improvisational ceremony. Um, I heard two of my teachers arguing one day. Um, uh, Judith Gleason, who was the translator of some of the praise poetry we read, and Karen McCarthy Brown, and it was, do you get the Orisha that you're most like, or the one you need? And the jury remained out. You know? And then there's that, and Roland Biodun and Uli Bayer talk with each other, and they say, and they say, the way it used to be, it's not so much now. And this was writing maybe 90, I don't know, 93. But they said you could look at somebody and know who their Orisha was because they looked like it. And the end of Joseph Murphy's book, when he speaks to this woman, at this composed, present, older priest at a event, and he says, "What is an Orisha?" She says, "I am." And this is not She wasn't acting big. She was big. She was that one of your questions that in your email, Pooja, was the the inner dimension of the Orisha and the outer dimension. And it's always that. It's always that. Uh, and and what Joe Murphy says about the saints is so interesting because once again, it's not exclusivist. What about the encounter in this hemisphere of the Orisha and the Catholic saints? And people people are coming, so people are arriving in the Middle Passage and they're encountering these saint images and the Roman Catholic what Joseph Murphy calls the wide gate as opposed to the narrow gate um, sacramentally makes people Catholic and then they learn about it. But what that meant on the ground in Cuba and in Brazil was that the church organized people into houses according to their ethnic identity for the purposes of Catholic education. But what it did was it allowed people to create these naciones, these communities. And people made, and people, it was also a world, they were coming from a world with images and events and rituals and processions and the incarnate breaking through into this world all the time in ways that touch all the senses. And that was that's what they knew. And that's what people's Catholicism in Brazil and Cuba was too. And it was through the saints. And so they looked at images of the saints and the iconography and they said, okay, um, um, St. Patrick, old man with a staff, snakes. That's like Damballa in Haiti. That's old Loa spirit with wisdom and maybe some infirmity and connected to snakes. The the is a snake in one of his incarnations. So people people made those connections and it was useful. And Murphy says a mask is um, conceals, but it reveals at the same time. So Damballa, so St. Patrick is concealing Damballa, but revealing Damballa at the same moment. And going further, he, Murphy interviewed somebody who said, what are these pictures? Or the saints and the Orisha, what's the difference? And they said, oh, well, the saints are the ways of the whites and the Orisha are the ways of the blacks. But they also talked about this idea that, so who are these figures like Santa Barbara, who is a crowned red and white and a woman with a crown and 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 holding a sword. And they saw Shango, the sovereign of Oyo. Gender, it cut through gender. This is she the Catholic martyrology was that she converted to Christianity. Her father didn't like it. He was a barbarian. He was a non-Christian, Barbara, and he shut her up in a tower, and the lightning struck it. So So she died rather than capitulate. But Yoruba folks looked and said, ah, royalty. Ah, red and white. Ah, the power of lightning. Ah, the sword, regal, all of this. Shango, the first, the legendary leader, the king of Oyo. So, so how did they think about Santa Barbara? Murphy says they sometimes somebody is so powerful, it's an avatar. Sometimes somebody comes into this world and embodies the Orisha so deeply that that relationship is so intimate and so powerful that it gives a tint to how the Orisha is in this world from that human life. It's that powerful human life in in connection with the Orisha. And and so um, Karen Brown tells this beautiful story that she is at a bembe at a voodoo ceremony with her teacher Mama Lola, who's a mambo, and um, and her teacher Mama Lola has her brother there at the moment. And at one point in the ceremony, Mama Lola goes into trance with Ogun, the Loa or Orisha in another tradition, Ogun, and the brother cries. Why? He says that his sister, he sees that his sister is channeling their mother's aspect of Ogun. It's that you've it's Ogun, but Ogun is huge. Ogun is an Orisha. So people tap elements, tap parts of this cosmic personality. Um, Judith Gleason, who was an Oya, and that's the whirlwind. That's all the colors. That's you ask her for her number is 9, and you ask her for one thing, and she brings you 9, 8 of which you did not want. She's this when I would ask her to bless me at a ceremony, she would go, temper rise and then fall. And she's not afraid of the dead. Shango, the big sovereign, is afraid of the dead. Oh yeah. Judith Gleason says, customs officer on the life-death frontier. She so Judith said that one of her saints that she's connected with is Teresa of Avila. And Judith, the whirlwind, says, you know, I'll bet that was good for Oya. She learned a little bit about bureaucracy and organization. So it's like that. And once again, you hear adapting, but not losing this living. Okay, so a core concept in Yoruba thought is ashe, the power or authority to make things happen. And it's as if I still haven't found the right metaphor, but it's like a pie section. Each Orisha is a part of that ashe that is the universe. Mine is Oshun, fresh water. So I see the world. I see that part of the world most clearly. I see this world as a world of water. It's and that is a door that keeps opening and opening and opening and opening and opening. but it's not more real than my adopted son who's an Ogun, or my brother who was a Shango. It's a it's a Roger Bastide wrote a book called The Interpenetration of Cultures. So the interpenetration of beings.
That's really beautiful. Yeah. I think as you speak, like the theme that's sort of jumping out at me is just how fluid the tradition is, in how it understands like any concepts. Um, Even as you were talking about the sort of this open question of whether you get the Orisha you're most like or the one that you need. I think that there's something beautiful in the fact that it's not really prescriptive in that sense, right? It's not just, this is the methodology, this is the methodology. It's a sort of relationship. It's a sort of being, that doesn't really fit into those, questions. And
Right.
that really, ties into how, one might understand the concept of the self through this tradition as well. That, you can't really ask this question and expect a clear answer. It's just it is, it's a way of understanding being. Um,
And just to add to that, I said that, Judith Gleason laughs and she says, "Oh yeah, I learned something from Teresa of Avila." But maybe, but also you could say, "Oh yeah, I knew it all the way along somewhere." And Louisa Tiche, um, a priestess of Oshun, um, African American, grew up in Louisiana, and she initially had worked in a number of wisdom traditions. And initially, when she got um, read as Oshun, she said, "Oh, hell no, blonde bimbo," because that's the way she'd been presented in not Nigeria at all, but in the diaspora in some places. But then what did she do? But then she became that and profoundly found the aspects of Oshun that is a woman with a knife. I take my protection by your side, and the old woman who rocks at the bottom of the river, and the vulture, and all of these powerful elements. Were they there too? Yeah. But it's this dynamism that then she brings it into this world in this moment, this from this immensity of cosmic stuff.
I think it's really fascinating going back to the last point you made about like seeing a like knowing somebody's Orisha just by looking at them. Just I don't know why I didn't see all the yellow in the background, in the go, which is the Oshun. Yeah, so I completely forgot about that. But I think touching on the assay, and I think there's a part in your dissertation we talk about the pada. Would you like to elaborate more on that,
Mm.
please?
This is what I mm, this is a big deal, and I've talked about it at a conference and had people say, "Oh, you don't know what you're talking." But my so the only so I think it I this is the next thing that I really need to be writing about, because this the person who did consistently talk about this, and was my brother, Shango. And once again, and the way he talked about it was this herb, this incantation, this moment in Egungun ancestor performance. And yeah, so I see it in um, yes, on the very surface, para means come back, return, see you later. But Yoruba language, I use nation without much point here, but it's a national sport, is to take a word and unelide it. It's what people do when they sit around in the afternoons with a beer and talk about town history, rival communities, and they make all the points by saying, you know what this word means? Well, if you take it and you. So anyway, I really think it's key, and I want to be writing about it, and because I think it's essential. What I did in the dissertation was to write about the things that I think are central here, but I used two words that are Western, and I want to get them out. And one of them is agency, and one of them is embodiment. And we know that embodiment doesn't work because there's a beautiful book called Gods of Flesh, Gods of Stone by Pooja, do you know it? It's a set of essays on Hindu religion. Joanne Waghorn is one of the editors. And she has an introduction and she says, all these words like embodiment. Well, I don't know if she says this, but she says it's built. There are things you can't say in English. Things are based on a dualism, a mind, spirit, mind, body dualism. And that's not what's going on in Yoruba. What I'm thinking about at the moment is when my father talked to me about carvings, about shrines becoming active, he said, he talked in terms of walaye, coming to life or coming into life. That's very different from saying something is embodied. It's different in what it's saying both about this world and whatever else there is.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Especially, I mean, even tying back to what you were talking about earlier with people sort of going in and out of this world and sort of the other world. They're not sort of two distinct realities, but you sort of exist in both almost simultaneously. Like there's an element of the self that is tied to both of these. Um, but would you want to elaborate more on, I know you spoke to embodiment, and why that term doesn't really work, but also you had mentioned agency and that term. So what is, I guess, the duality there? Why does that term not quite capture the concept?
Don't know yet, but I think part of it is this idea of that this discreteness of agent and of who is doing this, and then there's my brother saying, my father taught you. And he's saying, no, you taught me. It's so I think yeah, that's what.
Yeah, it's a really interesting approach to, I think, kind of across traditions you see an emphasis on like erasure of the self. But just the fact that you can't even construe of one sort of concrete self, or like if you do something, it's not even necessarily you that's doing it. It's the Orisha, it's, your ancestors and, the ways in which their souls sort of interact with your being. Um, I think it's an interesting view to a similar idea that you kind of find across traditions. Um, I did want to ask, going back to what you were talking about earlier with Ashe, um, you mentioned also in your dissertation the connection to Aje and like feminine power there. Um, could you speak to sort of like the feminine with relation to Yoruba tradition, just understanding and like, I
Sure.
guess the sort of duality there?
Yeah. And okay, yes, but I want to backtrack for a minute. And just because I'm saying that this idea of the self is not just the self, but also ancestors and Orisha and all, it doesn't mean it's not you too. And and there is a very important idea that says character is very important in Yoruba thought. And it says Iwalewa. Character is beauty. Um, so there is there's a very strong value on doing the right thing, but it's not it doesn't come from prescription like a set of rules. It comes from stories about how individuals who are concentrations of ashe of a certain kind, how they operate in the world. And many of the stories are how they did it terribly. And what it does is then it says, okay, so this is what this sphere of being is, and set of things in the world. So what are you going to do? It brings it back to the person, but choice is really important. It's just not even more important. Uh, so it's not an erasure of the the person. Okay, so gender. I'll come at it from a couple of directions, or at least three. The Eshu, who any ceremony starts with Eshu, um, who's the catalyst, who's the communicator, who's between Orisha, the other Orisha, and people. Uh, and one of their um, phrases is the one who belongs to all sides of a controversy with no apology. Um, so now where was I going with that? So so many parts to this to try to speak to that. One is that you look at this social, political, economic world, and you see a world in which women have their own money, and 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 households and women, At this point, but it wasn't always the same, and it still isn't entirely. Uh, at this point, lineages are are patrilocal, but so women have the household they're married into and their birth household, and and households are, until the British did their best, our land was corporate, and still people don't really think of it. I think this idea of owning land doesn't sit well with a lot of people, and certainly not individually and by one man in the lineage. But so women are with I can't know what life was like before 150 years of the British, but we know that women have their own economic life. Women are priestesses, women are uh, present, fully present. Um, that sounds little, but it's not. I mean, um, so there's that backdrop. And when Christianity came to Yoruba land, um, there were people who took part of it again, and then other parts they said, no, we're not doing that. Um, one of them was that um, the, the British refused polygamy, but they condoned slavery. And they kept men in the church, but they kicked out second wives and second families. And there were people who said, oh, we're not doing that. We're starting independent churches like the Caribou Wetu Serafu and CAC and others. And they said, and when they were pushed, they said, have you read the Hebrew Bible? Did you read it? Um, so but another thing that held over was that a number of the independent churches, certainly Caribou Watu Serafu, were founded or co-founded by women. But then in that world, that colonial world, and it's happened here too, frequently these independent churches by a generation or two were male-led. But still this idea of female leadership and female access to, whether it's you call it trance or you call it prophecy, did not go away. So there's that. So another part of this story is the power of mothers and the power of motherhood. And one thing I always love when I'm teaching in class and I have students who are African American, Afro Caribbean, and we get to talking about mothers, but so many places in the world. I just suddenly thought of a Palestinian student who was looking at an African American painting and went and began to talk about her mother's house. But when I say, you know that phrase, I brought you into this world and I can take you out. Or so there's all and there's a Yoruba proverb that says, um, what is it? But the second part of it is mother is gold. So that's the and if you don't get that, you know, like if you think it's all about fathers in Yoruba land, you missed it. So there's that. But then there's this other idea that that runs across it, and that is that well, people talk about a female year or a male year, and people hope for a female year, that it's cooling, it's healing, it's an ero, it's a medicine that heals. That's true too. Uh, but then there's this other thing, which is that this world is about Ashe, the power and authority to make things happen, this um, stuff. And it really overrides gender every time. So there's one example is in the 19th century, the Yoruba Wars, these wars between subgroups and just raging wars, and some towns were just emptied, and some new cities like Ibadan and Abeokuta that didn't have long histories of sovereignty were built up. And so whole groups of people would arrive in another town as refugees and set up a quarter. And they would bring their Orisha with them. And as you know now, the Orisha are elastic. They've got many qualities that different people with their needs and proclivities tap different parts. So if people arrive in a city in which there's already a Shango, a thunder and justice and lightning deity, then Shango becomes the junior. And if you're in the patrilocal world, that means you call Shango the wife. But Oyewumi, a Yoruba writer on gender, she said, those words are not husband and wife. They simply mean the one who marries in as opposed to the one who's already there. And there's really good evidence that yes, like like I've been called an elderly woman when once met me and found out I was an Oshun, and so she called me her husband. What did it mean? It meant that her husband was from an Oshun family, and I was an Oshun, so I was from his family. So I was her that. I was the one she'd married into. So people made that connection for Shango without it being, oh boy, this is a female thing. Another example was that Orisha Oko, the deity of the farm, um, people brought them to this town where there already was one. Okay, you know what you don't have? You don't have you don't have an Orisha who deals with people who use power secretly. We've got that. Refocus Orisha Oko. So, and what I noticed with so there's that. Ashe overrides anything, including gender. And when you have a world also in which there are female and male priests who contact the divine, who channel the divine, who so what else do you need? So now there's one more part though. And that is this idea of balance and twinning. I don't know. I just know that when I was living in Nigeria on the Fulbright, I paid attention to Yoruba English, people speaking in English, but it was a window to the Yoruba beneath it. And you, and even though if you look at popular media, which is Christian influenced, there's all this about witches and female, and I can say some things about that. But when my brother would talk, he would say in English, he'd say the witch and the priest and the priestesses, the witch and the witches. So it was not gendering it. It it was or it was saying there are these two. And I, at the city shrine, the and this was 1992, the priest sat along one side and the priestesses sat on the other. And when my brother and I took a photo, he took a photo of me sitting with the priests, and that was just fine. And I took a picture of him sitting with the priestesses. We didn't think about it except, oh, this is nice. So they were separate, but it wasn't, it, I never heard an identity thing about my brother lobbied for the priest because they were the guys he hung out with. But that was not ideological. That was like, be nice to them, they'll be nice to me. You know? So that profound this coupled with so so that's what. And when when um when Joseph Murphy and I edited the Oshun book, we in our introduction talked about that this is all the things that Oshun is, all these female things. This is female. I wouldn't write it that way if I wrote it now. Because after that, I met, some of the the shrines that compelled me the most, the Oshun shrines on the Oshun River. There were two that I felt a real deep connection with. And they were Oshun as a young male hunter. Yoruba, it goes as far with a gender idea, and then poof, it's the other one.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. It's like there's clearly like an understanding of this sort of polarity or duality, but maybe like male, female, or like masculine, feminine isn't even necessarily like that dividing line, or there's not like one dividing line and half of the world is on this side and half of the world is on the other side. It's, the line kind of moves based on where you're standing and looking at it from.
Mm-hmm. And strength and power and bloodthirstiness and tenderness and generativeness are not gendered. And you see in the stories or you see that all the time. So it's complete Western import that one side is weak and one side is strong, or even the ways in which they're weak or strong.
That brings me back to a point, to something I remembered. Before taking your course, so I listened to a lot of Afrobeat music, and so there's this one song, it's called Sandiata, and it's essentially, I had never heard of, like, I didn't know it was a story, or or it was an epic or whatever. It was this, outside of just the title for the song, but the song is really about this artist who's talking about reclaiming his identity from those sort of like Western conception of like Africans.
Mm.
Uh, and after reading the epic of in your course, And it just makes so much sense as like how these sort of like very old and stories or epics are deeply meaningful. They have some deep meaning to those who especially in sort of like I don't know if I want to just reduce it to just uh, uh revolutionary ideas or anything like that, but they are very much, especially when we talk about mothers. This is the point I really wanted to get to.
Mm,
Ch like when he talked about the song, it was not really when he talked in the song, it was not really sort of like gendered, but he talked about the story, right? How like, his roots and how Africa is just like this is very storied and beautiful and people, it's a place, full of strong peoples and so just reading the story again, it's sort of like, and as we were talking about mothers and stuff, I kind of just like connected it just now and like, wow, yeah, this is exactly what he was talking about. He's using this story to sort of like claim, take back this sort of like identity that was lost through the, colonization process. And so I don't know. I thought that was deeply meaningful and think about like how people imagine themselves or how they see themselves in this sort of like world, where they are sort of like fallacious or the narratives that's been promoted by these you know
yeah.
um colonized you know sort of ideas or um yeah, I don't know. It's just all sort of like just came full circle for me just now. But yeah, that's beautiful in that it definitely was not a gender thing, but I do think like the whole idea of mother of being like
Others.
connected to yes, mothers and being connected to like Africa, not so much though he didn't talk about it that way, but it's still the same concept, but like I don't know, it's just beautiful to me. But
And,
yeah, I'm sorry.
yeah, no, no. And Sanjara, Sanjata, Sanjara, it actually means Sogolon's mother. So the name that this ruler of the Mande who unites indigenous religionists and Muslims into this one empire, and his name is literally means his mother's lion. So it's all about, yes, he's the big face. And yes, everybody is really clear where all this potency came from. I think, and 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 I and that thing about diaspora, I think one of and what I see my job being in the classroom is these ideas that this progress model of feminism, this one size fits all, this idea that women had no power until just now, centuries of market women. You couldn't own property in Florida until the 30s. Come on. I mean, this idea, I just heard this idea, people talking about the Declaration of Independence and this idea that this, wow, um, society for everybody. We know that it came that some of the most useful ideas came from indigenous peoples living here. Restorative justice, Kingdom of Congo, before 1700. The idea that a lawsuit was a little death, that with the idea that if at all possible, you were reintegrating people back into their community. You look at healing ceremonies in South Africa, and it's what later here gets called like systems therapy,
Mm.
systems psychology, that it's not about one person, it's about a dynamic. Economic sharing. I mean, what the British did in Nigeria was to take a sophisticated, and I always think that's my catchphrase, looking at these worlds, social sophistication. They took a Yoruba political system that was profoundly checks and balances and knocked out all the checks and balances. So that because they were looking for indirect rule because of mosquitoes. uh, Somebody I knew in Nigeria said that forget the unicorn and the whoever else it is on the Nigerian flag. It should have been a mosquito because it kept the British out for a long time. Um, but um, what they did was they needed rulers in each of the three parts of Nigeria. And in Southwest Nigeria, there were rulers, but they were not always men. But there were all these other groups that checked their power and could even compel a ruler to commit suicide. And the British invalidated all of those. And so that the sovereign now was, on the one hand, much more powerful than a sovereign had ever been in this world. And on the other hand, no power at all, of course, because they were a puppet. So this idea, I mean, Akan market women and their ways of organizing and ways of and developing modes of negotiation. These are old systems. And students, by and large, don't know any of these and think that they're American and they're new. And to know that these, I mean, it's profound. So aside from it having the ability to make you profoundly angry, it's also a way of saying, wow, for diaspora African people, hey, we've been knowing this for a long time, and we've been doing this for a long time. And for everybody to say, hey, how about we try that? And if it's been done in some places, I mean, that's the profound, like, okay, so these are not, things do not have to be constructed in one way. So we can do it differently here.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing. I feel like that's honestly a really good way to kind of tie together a lot of the conversation that we've been having and kind of bringing it back into sort of the import of these ideas and what learning about them can sort of mean for a student, for a listener, for a learner, um, for someone who's trying to think about like, you know, what society should be like, what the self is, all of these questions. But yeah, we've kept you for quite a while, so I
I I've been having a great time. Thank you so much. And I love the lens, this personhood lens that at first I thought personal. That's just like And then I began to think, and then your questions were
And your answers were so in-depth and
great. We're what?
were very in-depth and took this in, all sorts of directions I, didn't think that the conversation would go in. So we really appreciate your time and your willingness to join us.